Hello, Year 11. Just before I start this lesson, I do want to say a little bit about assessment going forward. At the moment, the government have cancelled the summer exam series for Year 11. And at the moment, there is a consultation going on involving Ofqual, the body that manages the exams, and other interested parties about what evidence schools would need to submit to support the grade predictions for students. That consultation is ongoing, so at the moment we don't have a clear picture of what evidence we're going to need from you as students to support any grades that we submit. So it is really important that we continue to build up a portfolio of evidence showing your skills and abilities in history. So with that in mind, today's focus is going to be just on exam practice and refining your technique, because there may be a possibility that you have to sit some form of formal assessment done in school or at home set by the exam board, and those assessments will obviously be based on your skills in answering questions in history. So we'll move forward with this lesson. Thank you. Okay, before we start, we can give you some confidence here. Staff at St Wilfrid's have worked very hard in creating lessons that allow students to develop really sound exam technique in all of the questions they attempt. If you look at this chart here, this shows some comparative data. It shows the performance of St Wilfrid students historically on the left versus all Edexcel students, the national cohort on the right. And today we're going to focus on question 3A, which is the sources question. And you can see the skills you're about to learn allow our students at St Wilfrid's to average 5 out of 8 virtually on this question, whereas students nationally only average 3.84 out of 8. So the skills you're about to learn will give you an advantage. So we'll move to the next slide. Okay, Year 11, if you could just put this as your heading today, and it's how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the reasons for the growth in support for the Nazi Party in the years 1929 to 32. Explain your answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. So just pause the video and copy that title down and then move on to the next slide. Okay, so remember, this is the utility question, and what the examiner's really trying to ascertain, trying to find out, is your skills as a historian under pressure. So they're asking you to examine a source and infer from it or understand from it or pick out information from it that will be useful for the inquiry focus. Now, there are a number of key stages to follow, and we're going to look at stage 1 first, and that's assessing the content of the source. So the first thing you have to do is, what useful information can you infer about reasons for the growth of Nazi popularity? You've got to look for 2 to 3 points. And remember, an inference is an idea or conclusion that's drawn from evidence and reasoning. So an inference is an educated guess. And when you make an inference, you're reading between the lines or making reasonable assumptions. So on the next slide, we're going to give you a few hints about what you could reasonably infer or conclude from source B, this photograph, about the reasons for the growth of Nazi popularity. So we'll move to the next slide. Okay, so photographs are sometimes quite difficult sources to use. So we need to do a few things first of all. We do need to read the attribution because there might be things in it that help us. So the attribution, that's the information the examiner gives you about the source, is always at the top of the source. So our attribution here is, it's a photograph published in 1932, so that's at the height of the Great Depression, in a German newspaper. It shows people from Hanover, that's a German city, queuing for their unemployment benefits. The writing on the wall of the building, and that's in graffiti, and you've got a blue arrow pointing to it, says "Vote Hitler." So basically, the examiner wants you to make a couple, one or two, preferably two, inferences about what in this source could remind us about why the Nazis grew in support in the years 1929 to 32. So again, what I'll ask you to do, and pause the video whilst you do this, is what reasons for popularity can you infer from the Nazi graffiti, "Vote Hitler"? And what reasons for the growth in support or popularity can you infer from the massive queue of unemployed? So if you pause the video and have a look at that, and then we'll discuss the answers on the next slide. Okay, so I think we can make two legitimate inferences about why the Nazis grew in popularity and they had a growth in support in this period, 1929 to 32. So if we start at the right hand side first, so the length and size of the dole queue, that's the unemployment queue, reminds us of the chronic unemployment problem in Germany during the Great Depression and the poverty that followed. And the photograph is from 1932. The Weimar government was not solving the problem. So the first reason we can infer for the growth in support for the Nazi Party is obviously the impact of the Great Depression on the German economy and society. And then a second inference, this is on the left-hand side, that we could pick up, and this is more subtle, is that the source also suggests that Hitler and the Nazis were targeting messages at the unemployed, as we see a Nazi slogan, "Vote Hitler," painted on a wall next to the queuing men. So the two inferences we can take are obviously, perhaps the biggest reason for the growth in support was the impact economically and socially of the Great Depression and the Weimar failing to deal with it, even by 1932. And obviously there's a subtle hint there that the Nazis are really able to use propaganda to try and appeal to those people who are deeply, deeply unhappy. Okay, so hopefully we got those two inferences. So we've done stage one. We've made two inferences about why this photograph is useful for us in understanding the growth and support for the Nazis. We now need to do stage two. Stage two is where we prove to the examiner that we've got deep historical knowledge of the period, so we can develop those inferences and we can discuss them and we can validate them. So remember, you should have from a previous lesson a mind map completed whereby you explored the three factors that made the Nazis grow in support, that made them become more popular. And obviously the number one reason they became more popular was the impact of the Great Depression and the mistakes the Weimar government made in dealing with the Great Depression. So obviously you do have quite a lot of own knowledge, and you can see them in the two green boxes on the left, that you could add to your evaluation of the source. And also, we also looked at the use of tactics by the Nazis to promote their ideas and gain support. And one of those practices was the Gauss system and targeting the voters. So again, we can bring that into the inference we've made about the Nazi use of propaganda and making that propaganda appeal to those who are deeply unhappy. So you can see that you should be able to, in stage two, start thinking about applying some own knowledge to your evaluation, and that own knowledge will be taken from last lesson's mind map and indeed that 12-mark assessment you did in the last lesson. So we've made our two inferences. We've now got a lot of own knowledge in our head to support those inferences. we need to just do the final stage now, which is the ability to write 1 or 2 sentences evaluating what's called the provenance of the source. Now, the provenance of a source is how far that source can be trusted, its reliability. So to evaluate the provenance of a source, you've got to look at what's called the nature, origin, and purpose. The nature is what is it? The origin is when was it produced? And the purpose is why was it produced? Because that analysis could reveal some faults with the source or some strengths of the source. So when you look at the attribution here, it's a photograph, so it's a legitimate account of an event. It's published in 1932, so it is at the height of the Great Depression. It is in a German newspaper. So there's quite a few positive things you could say about the source. You could point out that it could be a narrow representation in that it's only one city, Hanover, but you've probably got own knowledge to back up the idea that the Depression and its effects were felt all over Germany. So on balance, you can say some positive things about this source. You can point out maybe 1 or 2 limitations, but its nature, origin, and purpose does make it quite a valid piece of historical evidence from the time. So now in the final 15 or 20 minutes of this lesson, you should be able to write up your findings, and you'll do it following this very precise writing frame. So this works for all inquiries and all sources. So you begin, the content of source B is useful for an inquiry into why support for the Nazi Party grew in the period 1929 to 1932. You can then say the source reminds us that one of the biggest reasons for the growth in support was the impact of the Great Depression on Germany. The source shows a huge queue of unemployed men, and then you can develop that further. And then obviously you can back up the legitimacy of this through your own knowledge about the impact of the Depression on Germany. You can then also suggest that the source is useful because it reminds us about the Nazis' use of propaganda. You can reference the graffiti in the background, and then you can develop this as a credible point by bringing in the Gauss system and Hitler's ability to target voters and the impact that had on making his party grow in support. And then finally, and this is underneath the red line, you can do stage 3, where you can introduce a discussion of the nature, origin, and purpose of the source. So you can start, however, the nature, origin, and purpose of the source must be examined. The source is an image from a German newspaper in 1932. As such, there are many positives. You can list those, but then you could also introduce the idea of it perhaps having a weakness in terms of it's a narrow focus on just one city. But in doing that, you'll meet the criteria that the examiner needs. You'll have made inferences from the sources, you'll have packed it full of own knowledge, and you'll have made legitimate comment on the nature, origin, and purpose. And all of that is what we call level 3 criteria in the question. That's the highest level of the question. That will give you access to 6, 7, and 8 out of 8. Which again is a really good score on this. And you can see from, or remember from my first slide, that our students do well on this question. If you follow this technique, so will you. Okay, that ends today's lesson. Well done.